Yes, of course, there are the midterm exams for us next week. Remembering that the way that we're going to do this is that Tuesday, so a week from today, is our exam, our actual exam. So you must be here for that day. But the following Thursday, when we normally have a class, that is a class that you can choose to go to, right? And why you would choose to go to that class is that on that day, I will do a one-on-one choice of meeting with you, showing you your grade, talking to you about what you did well, what you need to improve, and so on, right? So if you're busy that day or whatever, then you have another exam, then feel free to skip. But if you do want to know in depth about your grade and get your grade back as quickly as possible, then that Thursday class, right? Now that doesn't mean that if you can't make it to the Thursday class that you can't ask me about your grade. I will give you back your test, and I will, if you like, outside of class, sit down and talk to you about like what you could improve and so on. But that Thursday is for that, okay? All right, so what I've done today to help you is it's quite a straightforward kind of exercise for the midterm test, insofar as you already know in a moment what the questions are, right? I have also outlined on here how to write your answers, right? So the basic guidelines for how to approach this, and also what you're allowed to bring into the test itself, right? So there are no surprises, all of the kinds of things that we've been reading and doing in class. All those skills are, of course, then skills that I want you to transfer to be able to write about those stories in the test. Okay. So I'll pass this around now. Hang on, pass this around, and then we'll talk about, once everyone has a copy, we'll talk about. Actually, there should be. Let's add that to the file. Once everyone has a copy, we'll talk about and go over the test. Right? The questions will be what you can bring in, how to write the essay, and then if you do have any further questions, then I will also answer them now. But as I said, it should be, bless you, it should be very straightforward. Right? Missed the side of the room. Okay, so remember at the beginning of the semester I showed you how the course is divided up into 4 different topics, right? So the first half of our course, we're covering the topics of, first of all, folly and madness, and then our second topic, that of religion and superstition, right? So we have 2 questions on our midterm exam, 2 essay questions, right? And so each one asks you to write about these 2 different topics, right? So you can see there our first topic, essay number 1, the short essay number 1 that you need to write. The question for that one is, how does romantic fiction challenge the idea that humans are rational and logical? Right? Remember when we saw our introduction, we saw that this was a prevailing idea of the Enlightenment period that had come before Romanticism, right? So how does it challenge this idea that humans are rational and logical? And use examples from at least 3 stories in the folly and madness section to illustrate your argument. Right? So that means you don't have to write about all of the stories that we read for folly and madness, but instead you need to pick out of Poe's The Telltale Heart, Irving's Rip Van Winkle, Balzac's The Elixir of Life, Gogol Memoirs of a Madness, Hawthorne's Dr. Heidegger's Experiment, and Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, right? Out of those stories, you need to pick at least 3 of them to talk about, right? So not all of them, right? Because if you talk about all of them, you're not going to really have enough time and enough room to focus on them with enough depth, right? But picking 3 of them covers enough broadly of what we looked at, but also gives you enough space and time to be able to cover the topic in depth. Okay? So then our second question, and this time focusing on those stories that we've been reading in our second topic of religion and superstition. Romantic characters are often torn between conflicting values like good and evil, madness and sanity, duty and pleasure, right? All those different ones. So how do such conflicts influence the stories in the superstition and religion section? And again here, just like with the first question, you should pick out at least 3 of the stories, right? 3 of the stories to talk about and to analyze in depth. Okay. Before we get to talking about actually how to write these short essays, right? How to plan them and how to write them in the test, let's take a look at what you're allowed to bring into the test. First of all, the most important rule here is that you are not allowed, even though you have these questions ahead of time, you are allowed to prepare a lot, right? You're allowed to pick out which quotes you want to use, you're allowed to pick out what ideas you want to have, but you are not allowed to simply prepare the test at home and then just come and write it in the test time, right? This has to be something that you can prepare, but the actual writing of the test, the actual creation of your ideas must be in the test time, right? That is very fundamental rule, okay? So you must write this under test conditions, and basically, first of all, you're not allowed to bring in anything, any kind of electronic device. I mean, I know you'll have your phone in your bag or whatever, but that must be turned off, put away, right? So no dictionaries, right? Not even electronic dictionaries, none of that sort of stuff is allowed, right? If there are words that you don't know, look them up before you come in to the test, right? So you are allowed to bring in your copy of the course stories, right? So you're allowed to bring this in. You don't have to copy out the quotations that you want to use, right? I don't care if you've written in here, but I do have limitations on so far as things like sticky notes, right? You can put, some people like to put like the little colored notes so they can turn to a page quickly. You can put them in there, but there shouldn't be anything written on them, right? So, like I said, you can write notes in the margin and all that sort of stuff, but it must stay within those guidelines, right? It must still be that you are writing this from scratch, from notes rather than from just simply writing it at home, okay? So you can bring in this book, right? So that you can look up your quotations and you can see the parts that you've highlighted or underlined during our weekly readings, okay? Secondly, you are allowed to bring in 1 A4 size page of notes. And I want to really emphasize this, that this is something that when you bring in your page of notes, it has to be in very brief note form, right? Very short notes. It can't be like that you've written your essay at home and then you've like memorized every sentence and you just put a little prompt for 1 word and you cover the whole page with like, basically you've already written it, right? It must be that very brief kind of note form, very similar to what I use in the PowerPoints, right? And I tell you this, and I'm warning you all today, and I'll warn you again on Thursday, and I'll tell you at the beginning of the exam, if you don't follow with the notes exactly, then I will take those notes away at the beginning of the test. I will check everyone's notes to make sure that you've done it properly. So, right, 1 side of 1 A4 size piece of paper, right? If you have a notebook and the notebook is, let's say you take a page out of a notebook like Suryan has there, then that's fine too, right? I remember a couple of years ago when I taught one of the other literature class and I let them have 1 page of notes. I remember a student came in and she had a great big piece of, like those giant pieces of cardboard, right? And it turned out it was just a project for another class. But I thought, oh, well, she's decided 1 piece of paper is like this giant piece. But no, it was just that. So 1 A4 size piece of paper, you can type it, you can write it. Either way, it doesn't matter. But probably the best thing to do, and this is the way to be absolutely sure that I won't take it away on the test day, is if you want to get feedback or if you want to be sure, send it to me or show it to me, right? Just say, Peter, are my notes okay? Will you take them away? Please don't take them away on Tuesday, right? So if you show them to me, I'll say, all right, that's fine, right? Or no, you need to make it shorter, right? You need to cut it back, okay? So with regard to those notes, one side of one A4 size piece of paper. So not two pieces, don't write on the back, right? Just one side, one A4 size piece of paper, okay, in note form. Okay, and there, of course, bring a pen or a pencil. Don't care which one you write in. Do not, I sometimes see students in these tests, you have a limited time, right? So it's good to be organized. It's good to, get all your ideas down as quickly as possible. If you make a mistake, just scribble it out. It doesn't have to look beautiful, as long as I can read it. So sometimes I see students with those like whiteout strips going, must be perfect, right? Blowing and then writing out again, right? That's a waste of time. Just scribble it out and then just keep writing, right? As long as I can read it, and I can read, I'm pretty good at reading bad English handwriting, not so good at reading Korean handwriting. So, yes, Gustav?
Do you provide the sheet?
Yes, yeah. When you come into the test, there'll be a piece of paper like this, and at the top will be written the name of the exam, my name, and then the question, and blank, 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 blank. So you'll have 4 blank pages to write, and you won't, unless you're really fast or you write really big, you won't fill those 4 pages, right? And then at the back of that, right, question 2, 4 blank pages. Okay.
There are no lines?
No lines, no. But I do, and students always ask me before the test about how much should you write. I say that most of the good questions, most of the good responses I get are about 1.5 pages long, right? I mean, of course, it depends on how big or small that you write. But usually about 1.5 pages to 2 pages, that's usually going to be a solid response, right? If you're only doing half a page, it's too short, right? You're not going to have time to cover it. Okay. All right, so let's, and do bring more than one pen or pencil. Don't rely on just one. Your pen may run out even if it's a new pen, it can run out because it doesn't like the weather or whatever. So bring at least 2 things for that. And as it says there, no other outside sources, just your book, your page of notes, and pen and pencil. You don't need paper, you don't need dictionaries or any of that sort of stuff. Okay. All right, so how to actually write for each of these essays? Well, what I'm following here is something that is in basic composition is called the 5-paragraph essay. Right? This is used in standardized tests. It's used in basic writing classes to teach you how to write with structure. And we're also using it here because it's a very simple sort of model to follow, right, for writing about these kinds of stories. So the 5-paragraph essay obviously consists of 5 paragraphs, and I've laid out here what those 5 paragraphs should consist of. Paragraph 1 is the introduction, right? You have a question here, and so you need to tell us what is your angle, your take, your interpretation of the question. Where are you going to go with this, right? It doesn't have to be a particularly long introduction, but it just does have to indicate what you're going to say, right? What do you think about this topic, and be able to introduce it in the context of what we've been studying, right? By far, the most important part of the essay, though, is what we call the body, right? Those paragraphs 2, 3, and 4, in which you are going to be actually analyzing the stories, right? And given that, like, you understanding and being able to interpret the underlying ideas right? Using symbolism and the references and so on that we've been learning about during the course of the semester, right? That is really the number one thing that I worry about, right? That I care about, that I'm grading on, right? That's the number one thing, is your ability to show me that you can analyze these texts well, that you have a good grasp of the ideas, that you really understand what's happening in the stories, right? Those are the key things that you'll be graded on, right? So if your spelling and grammar is really, really bad, then I will have to take points off for that. But a spelling error here, a grammatical slip here, oops, I missed a word here, those aren't all that important, right, in the bigger context of it. Much, much more important is your ability to analyze the stories and to engage with the ideas that the authors here are trying to get us to think about. Okay, so that's really the number one thing, is to be able to analyze those stories. Okay, so in each part of the body, this is where, of course, you have to talk about 3 different stories for each question. So it makes it quite simple to think of each of those body paragraphs as being one of the stories that you need to talk about, right? So if you're talking about, question 1, then you might think, well, I'll talk about Poe's The Telltale Heart first, and then, then the Elixir of Life in paragraph, the next paragraph, and then Fall of the House of Usher in the next one, right? So that you give a separate body paragraph for each of the. So that there is a use a separate paragraph for each of those stories. Okay. So here, of course, in those paragraphs, first of all, you need to answer the question, the overall question, using at least one example from the story, right? And one of the ways in which you can show that you have a good grasp of the story, that you have a good detailed knowledge of it, is that I suggest that for each of those body paragraphs you include at least one quotation from the story, right? Don't just throw it in there, right? Use it as your example. Show me, all right? I have to show how this story challenges the idea that humans are rational and logical. So I need to pick an example. I need to pick a quotation or an example of what happens in the story that shows the story challenging this idea. And then I want to find a quotation that shows me the narrator or the character or an event that shows this happening. I'll quote it in the text, put the page number afterwards so I can see where you've taken it from, right? And then interpret that for me, right? Spend the rest of the paragraph saying, this is why, right? This is why this particular example from this story shows us that the Romantics are challenging this idea of we're just rational and logical beings, right? So each of those body paragraphs, assign it to a particular story, pick out a certain 1 or 2 examples, use quotations, right? At least one quotation for each of those body paragraphs, and of course, most importantly, tell me, interpret for me why. You notice that this strategy is very similar to what we had been doing in class with the prep sheets, right? So I'll ask you, pick out a section from the story, right? And you pick out a sentence or a paragraph or part of the page, right? In which you've picked out an example, and then in your prep sheet, as in our class discussions too, you tell me why it's important, right? Why it shows us certain things about the text. So those skills that you've been learning, or that you've been using for the class discussion and for prep sheets, are the same skills that you will need to succeed in the midterm, right? And then, of course, finally, the conclusion, which much like the opening, right, shows us, well, we started out looking at this question, you had a certain direction, we've looked at the evidence, conclusion, this is what we found, right? We found that Romantic authors challenge these ideas of rationality and madness in this way, or through these ideas, or through these strategies. Okay. So the notes that you have, you're going to have about half a page to take notes for like that A4 size piece of paper. So dedicate about half a page, right, to each one. Obviously, the main parts are going to be like, what are your basic ideas? What are the ideas and what are the page numbers perhaps that you quote from, right? So that you can think about, like, you can follow your outline for the essay. So, to just briefly summarize, and then I'll take any questions that you have, right? Remember, there are two short essays, right, for this test. Question number 1, question number 2. They both follow the two topics that we have covered, and you need to pick 3 stories from each of those to cover, from each of those sections. Right? You're allowed to bring in your book, 1 A4 size piece of paper for notes, right? And I've told you how to take those notes, and pen or pencil. Right? No phones, no electronic dictionaries, nothing else. And then finally, follow the rules of the 5-paragraph essay, introduction, where you state your position, and then the most important part, your analysis in each of the body paragraphs of each of the stories that you're looking at, conclusion. Right? Now, if you're particularly ambitious, you can look at more than the 3 stories. If you think, I can write really fast, I've really prepared, you could write about 4, but remember, this is about quality, not quantity, right? So you can write all 4 pages, you can cover all 4 pages, but if it's not good, you might as well have written, 1.5 pages and written a really good essay, and that gets an A+, whereas, something that is not so good might just get a B or a C. Right? So it's really about the quality. If you can show me that you can analyze these stories, then you might be successful in this test. So, are there any questions about this test? Like I said, I don't think there are any surprises as to what's in here. Right? So this is one of those things that it is very useful to prepare for, because if you, we have an hour and a half, and it would be really hard to just come here and see the questions for the first time and pick out your examples and write the whole thing in an hour and a half if you had no preparation. But it is very easy, very possible to do, right? It might take the full time, but you should be able to write each of these in 45 minutes, right? To be able to come in if you have prepared, right? You already know what the topics are, you already know what quotations you're going to use because you've looked at what passages and what pages you're going to use from the book, and you already know from your notes what the basic points are. Right. All good?
What if we did some note-taking on it?
That's fine. That's fine. As long as it's all note form, just like in the on the page, on the notes page, then that's fine. Right. In fact, I hope you are writing, notes and highlighting in the book as we go. Right. So that's what it's for. Okay. All right. So for today, let's come to our story then. We've already met Nathaniel Hawthorne. In fact, I kind of deliberately put our story from last time, Young Goodman Brown, together with this story, insofar as they both, obviously, they fit within this topic of religion and superstition, right? Because we saw that Young Goodman Brown, he's living in a Puritan time. He is, he's tempted by the devil, right? He goes to church. Obviously, he's raised in this very Christian and religious kind of context, and we've already talked about how Hawthorne draws upon the ideas and the themes of the Puritans and how they have influenced the American culture of his own time. Right? So we've already talked quite a bit about that context, and of course, in many ways, we can sort of recycle or reuse, right, those ideas. This is what happens when you read both more of a single author, and also that you read more from a certain kind of literary movement, like Romanticism, right? Is that you start to see, oh, I can connect the ideas that I saw in this story with the same patterns that I'm seeing in this story, right? So obviously, The Minister's Black Veil is not the same story. It has a different plot, right? Different characters and so on to Young Goodman Brown, but it is nonetheless dealing with very similar kinds of ideas and themes, isn't it? All right, so that context, that background from Hawthorne, we can reuse, as it were, from last time. So let's briefly go over what happens in our story. All right, we have the minister's black veil, a parable, and we see that, that Reverend Hooper is our main character. Right? What voice is this story told in? Third person, right? So we've seen this is important too to distinguish, right? Sometimes we have first person narrators, but first person narrators tend to be particularly unreliable. Right? They often are subjective, they're biased, they can tell lies and so on. Third person narration, right? What is the setting? Where is this story taking place? Yes? And we saw last time that like Hawthorne is setting these in like the colonial American times, right? So this is roughly, I mean, we're given much less clues than in Young Goodman Brown because there aren't so many historical references, but we assume that this is a similar kind of setting and context to to the last story that we looked at, okay? So it's in America, colonial America, and we see it's a Sunday, and our main character, Reverend Hooper, comes to the church, and normally he's a very sort of mild, calm, kind of gentle kind of guy that everyone sort of likes, right? He's sort of a nice guy, except today there's something different about him, which is that he has this black veil that he has put over his face. And so everyone comes to the church, they hear the bells, and they are surprised and kind of shocked to see this over the minister's face. Right? So we see the people of the town, they are like, is that really him? What's going on? Why is he wearing that? What's happening? He looks weird, right? And we see that even though he gives his usual kind of sermon, and he has all the usual kinds of mannerisms of Reverend Hooper, that the way in which his ideas, in which his sermon is received, is different, right? The congregation at the church, they are like, it is Reverend Hooper, but that veil gives his ideas a much darker sort of feel, sort of kind of weird and scary that he has it over his face. And so after the church service, of course, in this small town, the gossip is all about this black veil. And they're like, why is he wearing it? Has he done something wrong? Has he got some sort of secret that he's hiding, that he's trying to conceal, that he's trying to confess to, but he doesn't? It's so dark that he doesn't want to tell anyone. Right? So we're told a little bit more about his past. We're told that he has always been this very sort of mild-mannered preacher, and he's not the kind of like sort of firebrand, you will go to hell, I will, the very energetic kind of preacher. Instead, he's this very mild, very calm, very sweet sort of guy. But the veil on his face causes the whole of the population of the town to suddenly start treating him differently. Right? So we then see a conversation that at first we're told is just with a lady, right, who says to him, like, please tell me, why are you wearing this? Like, what's going on? Can you please take it off? And then, of course, gradually we learn during the course of the conversation that her name is Elizabeth and that she is his wife. And so even to her, he says, look, I can't take it off. I can't tell you why, right? And so they are sort of estranged from each other because of this decision. We then see that the Reverend Hooper is called upon to do some other duties that are common to a minister, right? So far as like the main minister is off doing some other things, so he is asked first of all to take a funeral for a young woman, and suddenly he goes to the funeral. Of course, he's wearing his black veil, and everyone's like, yeah, well, now it kind of makes sense. You know, here he is, funeral, death, darkness. Yeah, suddenly it means more. But then, on the same day, and that night, he's also then asked to prevail over a wedding. So he goes from the funeral earlier that day to the wedding, and of course he's still wearing that black veil. Everyone's like, oh, this is a bad sign. This wedding, this marriage is doomed. This is not going to turn out well. And you know what? When I saw at the wedding, I thought maybe the bride might have been the woman who died earlier that day. Right? They start all these sort of superstitious kind of rumors about it. So very similar to young Goodman Brown insofar as like the veil, just like Goodman Brown's dream experience in the woods, right, seems to change his personality. And so we're told that he lives for a long time, and he nonetheless is like a changed man. Before he was this very mild, sweet sort of guy. Now he seems still mild, but still also at the same time to have this personality change where he sees the world in this very dark and solemn and unhappy sort of way. So eventually, having lived for a long time, it comes to the end of his life and he's dying. And this other preacher comes along and he says, you know, that he says, well, you know, there must be some secret sin that all your life you've been wearing, or for so many years you've been wearing this black veil, right? Maybe it's time to tell us what you did. Maybe it's time to confess your sin and be at peace, and you'll you know, have peace before you die. And we see that he refuses, right? Even though he's weak, he summons all of his strength to resist having the veil removed, and eventually they bury him with the veil on. After he tells them, all right, you may not all be wearing veils, but to me, you should be, right? I can see the darkness in your face. You can see all the terrible things that you've done. All right. So, with that in mind, it's a brief overview of what happens in this story. Let's look at some of the symbols and references that are in here. First thing to notice, and this is almost always a big clue for any story, is that like the choice of title, right? Choice of title is something that is always done very carefully by an author, right? So if we look back to the Kleist story, for example, remember, we're told that the full title of it was St. Cecilia or the Power of Music, a Catholic Legend, right? And that subtitle of the Catholic Legend, right, was a big clue to us as to what some of the things that Kleist was doing in that story. In the same way, when we look at the minister's black veil, right, we are told that this is a certain kind of story, that of a parable. What's a parable?
Like teaching somebody something?
Yeah, it's a story specifically to teach someone, right? Now, of course, we've seen that all of our stories kind of are exploring ideas, but most of the time, our stories aren't directly teaching us something, right? So like when we read The Elixir of Life, like Balzac wasn't trying to like say, you know, obey your father or be good to your parents or any of those sorts of things, right? He wasn't preaching to us. He wasn't telling us how to think, right? So even though these stories have ideas and messages and so on and things that they're exploring, for the most part, they are not designed to teach us certain things. Whereas Hawthorne here, he's connecting this to a style of story that is designed to sort of teach us a lesson, right? Teach us about some sort of moral virtue or idea. And who's most famous for telling these kinds of stories? Aesop tells fables, which are very, very similar, right? Very similar. But, clues in the picture there, right? You can see Jesus. This is an illustration of him in the Sermon on the Mount, which he doesn't really tell many fables there, but that's more the other things that he talks about. But yeah, one of Jesus' most famous teaching methods was to tell stories that had an underlying message or idea that you were supposed to work out. Or in some cases, he would just tell you, right, that this was the meaning of the story. Okay. So, of course, the reason that we're seeing that Hawthorne is using this is that, of course, he's not saying that he is Jesus and that he's telling us a story in that sort of sense, but rather that he is saying this is a parable because it's connecting to a kind of religious tradition, right? It's a story that is designed to sort of get us to think about a certain kind of message, which of course is our job to work out today, what this story is doing. And therefore it's not literally exactly a parable in the sense that Jesus told them, but nonetheless it is meant to be influenced by that kind of storytelling. All right? So Hawthorne has here, on the one hand, parable as a story with a message, but also be knowing that the most famous teller of parables was Jesus, right? And so he's connecting it back to that religious tradition. Okay? So, anyone know any famous parables that Jesus told? All right. Probably one of the most famous is that of the prodigal son, right? The guy who's a grown-up young man. His father is very rich, and he says, "Well, Dad, when you die, I'm going to inherit all this stuff." And he says, like, "Well, can't you just give it to me now? I want to have fun while I'm young." So he goes and he squanders all of his money. He goes to parties. He courts women. He just spends it all on his friends and stuff, to the point where he's left poor, and then he ends up taking this awful job feeding pigs, to the point that he's so hungry that he wants to eat the pig food, right? And then he's like, I could go back and work for my dad, right? This is better than working for pigs. So he goes back to his dad, and he says he's expecting to say, "Dad, I messed up. Please take me back and let me work for you. I'll just, I realize I made a big mistake." And instead of chastising his son, his father, welcomes him back and, dresses him up in nice clothing, has a party for him, right? And he says this is meant to be like, of course, the point of the parable is that the father is supposed to be like God. The young son is supposed to be like humanity. Humanity goes off and sins and does stupid things, but then God forgives, right? So the point of the parable is supposed to be about God's forgiveness, right? There's uses the symbolism, right, of the father-son relationship, right? And so that's a famous example of parable. And there are many, many, many others. Some of them quite long, some of them quite short. Okay. So, of course, the central symbol of our story is that of the black veil. Right? So, black veil, first of all, we can see that there's symbolism of blackness or darkness. We've already talked about with other stories, haven't we? Right? Where we often have, in romantic stories, we've seen there's often a conflict between good and evil, bad and so on. And this is where we sort of have the symbolism of black and white symbolizing good and evil, right? So in this case, the blackness of it seems to use reference to sin, right? To evil, to bad things. But then also the veil itself. The veil, of course, is not something that is usually worn by men, is it? Right? Traditionally, it's a female kind of adornment. Right? So think of like weddings, right? The bride wears a veil at a wedding, for instance. So in this case, there is another kind of biblical connection, right? Religious connection that's going on here that has to do with, particularly we can see this in the Old Testament with God when he is displeased with people. We're seeing that he hides his face from them. So let's look at some examples of this from the Bible. Right? So in the times of Isaiah, Isaiah is an Old Testament prophet, right? And Isaiah is talking about how God, and telling the people of Israel how God is not happy with them. And so he says, in an outburst of anger, quoting from God, in an outburst of anger, I hid my face from you for a moment, but with everlasting loving kindness, I will have compassion on you, says the Lord, your Redeemer. Right? So this is Isaiah telling the people of Israel, right? You did something wrong, but like God came to me, he spoke to me, he said, look, you guys have messed up, and I've turned my face away, I've hidden my face from you, right? But I love you, so I'll not turn away again, right? I'll come back to you. Right? And similarly, again, the same metaphor is used in the book of Job, right? And Job is a very famous story about a guy who is very faithful to God, but God allows the devil to test his faith. And he takes away his family, he gives him all sorts of diseases, he takes away all his money and all his property to the point where just Job is sort of this sick, poor, wretched man, right? And still he keeps his faith in God. But at the same time, he keeps on asking God, why is this happening to me? So in this case, why do you hide your face and consider me your enemy? Why, God, are you allowing these things to happen? Why are you hiding your face? Right. And then in a somewhat different context, we also have when, around the time when God gives Moses the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament, Moses actually has this conversation with God where he says, well, God, can I see you? Right? I want to look at you. Right? We've had all these conversations. Can I actually meet you? And God says to him, well, I'm too awesome for you to look at. So you can sort of stay over there, and I'll sort of like walk backwards, and you can look at my back, and that'll be enough for you, right? Because if you looked at me, you'd probably die because I'm so great, I'm so awesome. Right, so he says, and he said, this is God, and he said, thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. And the Lord said, behold, there is a place by me, and thou shalt stand upon a rock, and it shall come to pass, while my glory passeth by, that I will put thee in a cleft of the rock, and will cover thee with my hand while I pass by, and I will take away mine hand. Thou shalt see my back parts, but my face shall not be seen. Right? So he sort of gets a glimpse of God, but just God walking away from him, but not full sort of face of God. Right? So this hidden face, it has like this connotation of both. We see that in God's case, it's like anger, right? Disappointment. And in the case of Reverend Hooper, it seems to be also an element of shame, right? Element of shame. We also have other important connections here. This is the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Of course, this is not really, it's just a painting of it. But in the Bible, we're told that when Jesus dies on the cross, the skies turn black, and the veil in the temple is mysteriously ripped in two. Right? Now, this wasn't just any veil. Right? This was the veil into a special part of the temple, of the Jewish temple, known as the Holy of Holies. right? So it's the most sacred place. And it's the place where only one person can go. And that is the high priest, who we probably presume is that guy there. He's got what's happening. And so the high priest, and he is only allowed to go in there once a year, right? A special like Jewish holiday. So this is another important reference to the veil. We see the quote from the Gospels in the New Testament now, from Matthew. He says, "And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain, from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent." Right. So there is both the Old Testament references to like the hidden face and to God veiling himself, and then this New Testament talking about like the removal of this veil. Okay, so then of course the other sort of fairly obvious symbolism, some of the other obvious symbolism that we have in the course of our story is, by the way, this is from a great movie I showed in my class last semester called Della Morte Della More. So you can see it's a sort of zombie comedy. So you can see that she is dressed up for a wedding, but she is only a head. That's all that's left of her. Right. So she's dead and alive. So remember, on that one day, Reverend Hooper goes to a funeral, right? Young woman who's died, and of course, a funeral we associate with mourning, death, all those sorts of things. And then on the other hand, he then goes to the wedding, and of course, we associate wedding with the opposite, with life and happiness and all the good things that come out of that. And of course, these are deliberately, like we've seen with so many other romantic stories, these opposites are contrasted to each other within the same day, within the same story, with the same character who goes to both of those events, right? To the point where a superstition arises that actually, maybe the bride, maybe was really the dead girl, the dead woman from the earlier one. Right, and then finally, we have a characterization of Reverend Hooper in, the middle of page 84. Right, in which we're told, in this manner, Mr. Hooper spent a long life, irreproachable in outward acts, yet shrouded in dismal suspicions, kind and loving, though unloved and dimly feared, a man apart from men, shunned in their health and joy, but ever summoned to their aid in mortal anguish. Right? So there's this sense of him as being what has become part of a sort of religious tradition of referring to later on to Jesus Christ as the man of sorrows. Right? And this quotation is actually from the Old Testament. Because there is this also a long tradition within the Christian religion of trying to portray the life of Jesus as being the fulfillment of prophecies made in the Old Testament. Right? So this is probably one of the most famous examples of this passage from Isaiah, Old Testament prophet, being used to describe, of course, he is not describing Jesus Christ, but then it is later on, this passage, this section from Isaiah is then applied by Christians to thinking of Jesus Christ as this man of sorrows. Right? And so even the painting that you see there, right, is a sort of a late medieval painting which has a whole tradition of, within painting, of painting the so-called man of sorrows depiction in painting. So there's a whole genre of this style of painting, of portraying the wounded, battered body of Jesus, right? As this sort of as this man of sorrows. There's even a famous hymn, right, called "Man of Sorrows" as well. So Reverend Hooper, in this passage, he doesn't use actually those words, but he's portrayed as this man who has gone from being this fairly calm, sweet sort of guy to being this sorrowful man who is apart from everyone else, who is sort of sees himself in the same sort of way as this tradition. Okay. All right, so let's turn now to our homework sheets and see what are some of the ideas that you picked out for today's story, and see if we can work out the deeper meaning of what it's talking about. Hiro, why don't you start today? What did you pick out from the story?
On page 84,
Yep.
the third last paragraph, the all through life that piece of that sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, from reading this passage, I could get a reason like why he covered himself, like with the veil, because the way it says that had separated him from happiness and made him sad.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was sort of his own. Well, it's his own. It was his own will to cover himself up. So I think he was sort of like punishing himself for.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe for his sins or the sins of the people.
Yep.
I just got that idea.
Okay. So yes, we see, and in here, it's very similar to young Goodman Brown. Of course, young Goodman Brown doesn't put a veil in front of his face, but that experience that he has in the woods is a sort of becomes a sort of in between, right? So it's sort of like this thing, this filter that he sees the world through. So in Young Goodman Brown, it's the memory, it's the experience that he has in the woods that makes this sort of filter for him to see the world as dark and unhappy and cynical, pessimistic sort of way. In this story, we have this literal veil that the minister wears, that, as is described in that passage, is this kind of screen between himself and the world, right? So of course, you can see through a veil, can't you, right? It's not like it's just, oh, where am I going, right? You can see through the veil, but of course, at the same time, the veil colors the way in which you see the world, doesn't it? So if you're looking through a black veil all the time, everything around you is going to look darker and like literally darker, as well as, of course, in the story, it's symbolism as it makes everything look sort of morally darker as well, doesn't it? Okay. Isleta?
I picked the 8th paragraph on page 81.
Mm-hmm.
And I picked that paragraph because it kind of shows, like, it's when he's at the wedding and he sees himself in the looking glass and gets kind of afraid of his own reflection.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's really kind of disgusted because he's afraid too. And I think it shows, like, Hawthorne, how he always plays with, like, the idea of human nature and how humans inherently are kind of sinful and bad. And even though, like, he's wearing this veil to show how other people react to him, he reacts the same way as other people do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also the looking glass is kind of like the symbol. He's seeing his true nature, and his true nature is humanity.
Yep.
And he's afraid of himself too.
Yeah, and if you remember back to the earlier story that we read of Dr. Heidegger's experiments, right? We also saw Hawthorne use that symbol of the looking glass, of the mirror, right? Remember in that story, he had the mirror in his study, right? And when we're first introduced to the study and he's describing all the things in it, we're told that like all the weird things that had happened in this study, the sort of like the mirror had reflected them back. And then also later in the story, when remember all 4 of the characters who've drunk the water of life, they're also like fighting with each other, and then they look over in the mirror, right? And they're like, whoa, what are we doing? What's going on here? Right? And so we have this similar use of that symbol there, right? Of the looking glass, of the mirror, that is used by Hawthorne. Yeah. So in most of the other parts of the story, it's people reacting like to this veil that they're seeing, and then this Reverend Hoop actually seeing it himself and having this reaction too. It's very interesting. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Charlie?
I picked paragraph 8 on page 83.
Mm-hmm.
His lover came to to ask him remove the veil,
Yeah.
but he rejected. From this paragraph, I know that Mr. Hoover didn't really enjoy wearing this veil. Instead, he felt extremely lonely. Yeah, as he said. This puzzled me a lot. Now that he didn't like it, why did he do that? So I guess that maybe he wore his veil to reveal truth that everyone has original sin, and also to alarm others that they were all sinful. But for people around him couldn't understand him, so he felt very lonely.
Yep. So this idea of original sin that we talked about last time is, it's quite an interesting one insofar as it's also quite controversial in certain ways, because when people think about like the idea of sin, if you haven't sort of been brought up or studied the sort of the theological idea of original sin, we usually think of sin as like the bad things that we do. So we lie, we steal something, or whatever it is. We think of those particular sins as being what sin is. Whereas original sin doesn't think of it as that way, right? Original sin is not about a particular sin that you've done, but rather refers to the sinful nature that you have inherited supposedly from Adam and Eve, right? So that means, like, even if you're a newborn baby, right, that you have original sin. And St. Augustine, the guy whose picture we saw and who originated this, the original sin, original idea of original sin, he even famously and controversially claimed that, like, if you are a newborn baby and you die, or even if you die before being born, that those babies go to hell because they haven't been saved, right? So there is this, like, when we think about this question of like choice and will, right? We see here that, like Telling, you said that there's a sense that Mr. Hooper doesn't just like decide, oh, I'm going to wear a veil because I see the world in this way, or I want to see the world in this way. He seems to be wearing it in spite of his choice, right? Like he has no choice in the matter, is the way in which he presents it. Okay. And this is similarly how this idea of original sin works. It's not like you can say, well, I could choose to sin or not to sin, right? The idea of original sin says that you don't have any choice. You're born with it, right? So you're born with it, and therefore you have to like be Christian, and you have to convert and acknowledge Jesus as your Lord and Savior and all that sort of stuff, right? And that's the only way that you can do it. If you're a baby, you die, you go to hell because you haven't been saved, right? According to like the very strict interpretation that St. Augustine has of this doctrine, right? So that leads us, as I said, to this question of choice, right? Original sin has this idea of no choice, right? You can only be saved because God is so loving and so gracious that he's like, I'll save you anyway, even though you're a horrible, sinful creature. I'm so nice, I'll save you. Remember, the opposite view, or the other contending view, was the Pelagius's view, in which he said, well, we've been corrupted by sin, but we could be nice, and God would eventually say, oh, you've lived a good life, and that you can be saved. Right? But that's the view that the church, even though most people seem to think that that's what the church believes, actually rejected that view. Said, no, we're going with St. Augustine's idea of original sin. So here we have to think about this choice. Is this something that Reverend Hooper is doing as a kind of performance, right? Is he like trying to teach people a lesson? Is he doing it to show off? Is he doing, like, why is he doing this? Because even though original sin, according to that doctrine, is not something that's voluntary, wearing a veil on your face is something that you can avoid doing. I avoid doing it every day. I manage not to wear a black veil, right? And so we can see that it is a kind of choice in this case. But the way in which our main character thinks about it, he doesn't approach it that way, does he? Right? He approaches it with this, I can't take it off. There's nothing I can do. But even when my wife, Elizabeth, asked me to do it, right? Even then, I can't. Right? So that question of choice is really, really important one here. Okay, Jan, how about you?
I think the second to last paragraph on page 85, which is last words of Mr. Cooper before he dies. I thought it was interesting because it reveals genuine thoughts that Mr. Cooper had toward other people. That everyone has the black veil on themselves,
Mm-hmm.
like him. In his purpose, so he's kind of showing his remorse toward others that they were afraid of him just because he had the black veil.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted people to approach him without any bias mind about the veil, but it turned out that this was too hard thing for ordinary people to follow.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And he says, doesn't he, at the end, when he says, I look around at all of you guys gathered around me, and even though you're not wearing literally a black veil, he says, I can see all of you are wearing a black veil. Right? Now, of course, he's the one that's actually wearing the black veil. So when he's seeing all of these other people, like it's a reflection of that, isn't it? But you know, he sees it as other people who are wearing this as well as him. So it's a very interesting conclusion there. Okay, Surya?
Last paragraph, page 79.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the religious scale acts as a mirror. Because in the verb, beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yep.
what aspect that you saw in the minister
Mm-hmm.
was just what they had in their lives. They would just say their sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think the interpretations of the different. Like, maybe you might think that the minister suddenly began to hate some lights, so that he wears, he's a clear, the veils, or maybe he might have some scar on his face, something like that.
Right.
The interpretation is different, but like their interpretation is in that case,
Mm-hmm.
it's just we had to think.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the actual word that Hawthorne uses at the beginning, like the first sentence there, he says it's an unaccountable phenomenon, right? Which means it's something that can't be explained, right? Like you said, it's not like, oh, he gets sunburned easily, or he has a scar on his face, or any of those sorts of things, right? It's not something that can be just explained by anything. And even when his wife asks him to explain, right? She's like, well, did you do anything wrong? Is there something that you're trying to tell me about why you're suddenly wearing a black veil? Right? And he says, no, there's nothing. I'm just wearing it. Right? So even though this happens in this religious context, notice too, we've already seen that there are other characters in romantic fiction that are like this. Right? So think, for example, of in the Fall of the House of Usher, Roderick Usher. Right? He's not religious, is he? Right? He's not presented to us as this religious kind of character. But nonetheless, he has like all these weird, unaccountable, strange moods, and he's strumming away on his guitar and singing his weird songs and engaging in all this unaccountable behavior. Right? These things that you can't really explain why they are doing this, and yet you can see that they're doing it. Right? So this certainly connects with that idea that I mentioned in the questions too, is that we can see that there are these parts of human behavior and human action that don't seem to just have an easy, logical, rational sort of answer. There's all kinds of behavior. We can understand the minister in the story. We can identify sort of reasons why he might. We can certainly see how this is not just completely unrealistic story. Like this could happen, right? We can understand it from a sort of emotional standpoint, but it's still not easy to rationalize, to explain exactly why he does it. Okay. All right, let's see. Someone?
Okay, so second paragraph on page
83. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I understand that this is about people being superficial.
Mm-hmm.
Just because of the background, maybe they don't really have, they don't really like this person anymore. But I didn't understand why he couldn't tell the wife either.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought maybe it could be like a lack of communication between people rather than just the problem of male, because I think from this paragraph the author wanted to emphasize that even the people who really love someone could could stop loving or could stop having the relationship they have, but he refuses to tell anything that he changed it. So I don't think this part could actually emphasize what the author is trying to say.
Mm-hmm. Although they don't actually stop loving each other, do they? Because we see when Reverend Hooper is dying, who is his nurse? Yeah, it's still his wife, right? But even though they're kind of estranged by him wearing the black veil, nonetheless, this sort of love relationship seems to have been maintained in some sort of way. But like you said, there is this split that comes about between them. But it suggests to us too, doesn't it, that if there was going to be anyone that he would tell, it would surely be his wife, right, as being the person closest to him. But even in this case, he seemed to put his whole religious ideas even above his wife and above the thing that he would supposedly care about the most, right, in the world. But he's saying, well, this is beyond the world. This is beyond any sort of earthly thing. Even my wife doesn't get to understand this. Right? So there is this connection to something outside, right? Something beyond that he's looking at, that he's saying transcends even that relationship. There's also a kind of, if we wanted to look at it through this angle too, we compared the looking glass to Dr. Heidegger's experiment. Remember too that Dr. Heidegger had his own love, Sylvia, right? That remember he lost her when he was young, even just before their wedding, right? And so there's this similar kind of theme here. Of course, Elizabeth doesn't die, but there is this sort of this split, and yet at the same time they're still connected to each other somehow. Right? So this is also a very common sort of romantic theme of the lovers that can't be together, and yet they somehow still have some sort of vague connection to each other. Okay, Minho, how about you?
I picked the paragraph right before the last
Mm-hmm.
on page 85.
Yep.
Which
Mm-hmm.
I think this paragraph is important because I think gets the meaning of the veil.
Mm-hmm.
In this paragraph, he says that every person now actually feels like
Well, that's one of the possible ways in which, like, certainly the Puritan Christian interpretation would be that, like, on the one hand, that the people, they see the veil and it's their own guilt that they're responding to, therefore they should also wear a veil, like Mr. Hooper says. A different interpretation, a more romantic interpretation, would be to say, well, or a more skeptical interpretation, say, well, the reason that they feel this way about it is because it is unnatural, it is weird to see the world in this dark way, to see everything as black and unhappy and pessimistic, right? So very, very similar to what we saw in the young Goodman Brown story, right, is when, in that case, it turned upon the dream, right, where we said, was it something that really happened in the woods, or was it just a dream? Were the people really bad and horrible underneath all of their goodness, or was that just young Goodman's Brown projection onto them, right? And here we have a similar kind of dilemma, right? Is that we have, is Reverend Hooper, is he right about these people, right? Should they all be wearing black veils? Or is it that this black veil has simply colored his view of the world, has changed his view of the world to make him pessimistic in this way, right? So we have equally these two different possible interpretations, just like we do in young Goodman Brown. Now, I also, to finish off today, because we're almost out of time, is I want you also to think about this story in terms of the kind of contradiction or paradox that I mentioned to you about the Puritans, right? Remember, particularly in the way that they dressed, right? They dressed in a sort of, they all dressed the same way. They dressed in like these sort of black, very plain, very ordinary sort of outfits that were designed so that you couldn't show off, right? There was no changing fashion. There was no ways. I guess you could wear pink ribbons in your hair, but that was about it, because otherwise